I still remember the sound of the applause stopping. 1 second, the conference room was filled with polite smiles and clinking coffee cups. The next, every pair of eyes was fixed on me as my boss, Richard Coleman, straightened his expensive tie and smiled the way people do when they enjoy someone else's humiliation. "Emma," he said loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear, "you're exactly what's wrong with this company. You mistake hard work for talent." A few nervous laughs echoed around the table. I felt my cheeks burn, but I refused to look away. "I've spent 6 years here," I replied quietly. "Every project I've led has exceeded expectations." Richard leaned against the conference table as if he owned the world. "You've spent 6 years making yourself look busy." He slid a thin envelope toward me. "Security will help you pack your desk." The room fell silent. Not one person spoke. Not the coworkers who had asked me to cover their deadlines. Not the managers whose mistakes I'd fixed at midnight. Not even Melissa, the woman I had considered my closest friend at work. She lowered her eyes. That hurt more than Richard's words. I picked up the envelope with steady hands, even though my heart felt like it was breaking apart. Richard smirked. "Maybe this will teach you your place." I nodded once. "I hope it teaches someone a lesson." He laughed. "I doubt you'll ever be in a position to teach anyone." Those were the last words he ever spoke to me as my boss. At the time, I thought I'd lost everything. I had no idea that day would become the beginning of the greatest decision of my life. When I walked into my apartment that evening, the silence was unbearable. The rent was already overdue. My younger brother Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by medical bills. He looked up hopefully. "How did the presentation go?" I couldn't answer. Instead, I placed the termination letter in front of him. His shoulders dropped. "They fired you." In front of everyone. He stood and hugged me before I could stop the tears. "It's okay," he whispered. No, it wasn't okay. Mom had passed away 3 years earlier. Dad had disappeared long before that. Everything depended on my paycheck. Ethan was still recovering from spinal surgery, and every physical therapy appointment felt like another mountain we couldn't afford to climb. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Again and again, Richard's voice echoed inside my head. "You'll never be in a position to teach anyone." For weeks, I applied everywhere. Every interview ended the same way. "We'll call you." They never did. One afternoon, an old client named Mrs. Alvarez called me unexpectedly. "I heard what happened," she said. "News travels fast. It does when good employees are fired for protecting clients." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "The numbers Richard wanted you to approve, they weren't accurate." Suddenly, everything made sense. Months earlier, Richard had pressured me to sign financial projections I knew were misleading. When I refused, he stopped inviting me to executive meetings. He cut my bonuses. Then came the public firing. "You were punished for saying no, Mrs. Alvarez said softly. After hanging up, I opened the folder I'd taken home months before. Not because I planned revenge. Because I had wanted proof that I hadn't imagined the pressure. Emails, meeting notes, revisions, requests with my refusal documented in writing. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I closed the folder. Not yet. I wasn't interested in destroying Richard. I needed to rebuild myself first. A month later, I accepted a junior analyst position at a tiny investment firm. The salary was almost half of what I'd earned before. My coworkers apologized for the outdated computers. The office coffee tasted terrible. But for the first time in months, people respected my opinions. I worked harder than I ever had. I stayed late learning valuation models. I studied mergers during weekends. I volunteered for projects nobody wanted. While others watched television, I read annual reports until 2 in the morning. Every lesson became another brick in a future nobody else could see. Years passed. My confidence slowly returned. So did opportunities. One promotion became another. I started investing every extra dollar instead of buying things I didn't need. I learned something Richard had never understood. Real power isn't loud. It grows quietly while everyone else is busy showing off. On the 5th anniversary of the day I was fired, I was sitting in a glass office overlooking the city skyline when my assistant walked in holding a folder. "You'll want to see this." I opened it casually. My heartbeat stopped. The company that had fired me was drowning. Revenue had collapsed. Several major clients had left. Debt had piled higher every quarter. Their stock price had fallen so low that analysts were calling bankruptcy inevitable. I kept turning pages. Then I saw a note attached to the final report. "The board is looking for private investors interested in acquiring a controlling stake." I stared out the window. 5 years earlier, I had walked out of that building carrying my belongings in a cardboard box while everyone watched. Now, for the first time since that day, a single thought crossed my mind. Maybe fate wasn't giving me revenge. Maybe it was giving me a choice. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence settle around me. 5 years ago, I would have celebrated the news. I would have imagined Richard begging for help, feeling the same humiliation he had forced on me. But success had changed something inside me. I wasn't interested in revenge fueled by anger anymore. I wanted justice built on truth. Still, I couldn't ignore the opportunity sitting in front of me. Arrange a meeting with the board, I told my assistant. She looked surprised. You think they're worth saving? I think they still have good people working there. That answer was more for myself than for her. A week later, I walked into the same headquarters where my career had once fallen apart. The marble floors hadn't changed. Neither had the receptionist's desk. But everything else felt different. People weren't laughing anymore. Employees hurried through the lobby with worried expressions. Conversations stopped when executives walked by. Fear had replaced confidence. I recognized several former coworkers. Most looked away awkwardly before realizing who I was. Melissa didn't. She froze in the hallway. Emma, I smiled politely. It's been a while. Her face turned pale. I heard you've done really well. I've been fortunate. She swallowed hard. I'm sorry. For what? She couldn't answer immediately. For staying quiet. The words carried more weight than I expected. I wanted to defend you that day, she whispered. Richard warned everyone that anyone who supported you would lose their job. I looked into her eyes. For years, I'd imagined this conversation differently. I thought I'd feel satisfaction seeing her regret. Instead, I saw someone who had spent 5 years carrying guilt. I understand, I said softly. You do. I understand fear. She began crying. I've wanted to apologize every day. I squeezed her hand gently. Then don't waste another day carrying it. As I walked away, I realized forgiveness wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was freedom. The board meeting began 20 minutes later. 7 directors sat around the polished conference table. The atmosphere was tense. Charts showing declining revenue covered the large screen behind them. One of the directors cleared his throat. Ms. Carter, thank you for meeting with us. I'm happy to listen. Another director slid financial reports toward me. As you know, we're seeking investors. I know. Our creditors are becoming impatient. I know. We've reviewed your firm's portfolio, and frankly, he hesitated. You're one of the few people capable of leading a recovery. Interesting. 5 years earlier, I wasn't considered capable of keeping my own job. Now they wanted me to rescue an entire corporation. What about your CEO? I asked calmly. The room became uncomfortable. One director sighed. Richard's decisions over the last several years have been catastrophic. I opened the reports. The evidence was everywhere. He'd ignored experienced employees, approved risky acquisitions, driven away loyal clients, promoted friends instead of qualified leaders. Worst of all, he had built a culture where nobody dared challenge him. Exactly the culture that had destroyed my career. The company isn't failing because of the market, I said. It's failing because people stopped being allowed to tell the truth. No one argued, because they knew I was right. Then the chairman leaned forward. If your investment group acquires controlling interest, would you personally consider joining executive leadership? The room waited. I thought about the employees working downstairs. People like Melissa. People who had families depending on them. People who would lose everything if the company collapsed. I have conditions. Every head lifted. First, there will be a complete independent audit. The chairman nodded. Second, no layoffs for frontline employees during restructuring. Several directors exchanged nervous looks. It's expensive. It's necessary. And third, I looked directly at each of them. No executive, including the CEO, receives protection from the audit's findings. Silence. Then, one by one, they nodded. Agreed. 3 weeks later, the acquisition was complete. My investment group officially became the majority shareholder. The media called it one of the most surprising corporate deals of the year. They loved stories about dramatic business turnarounds. They had no idea how personal this one really was. On my first morning as executive chair, I walked through the office before sunrise. Employees looked confused. Instead of hiding in executive offices, I introduced myself to receptionists, assistants, analysts, and interns. I asked their names. I asked what wasn't working. By lunchtime, I had learned more about the company than Richard had probably learned in years. Then my assistant entered my office. "Richard is here." I looked up. "He requested a meeting. Did you schedule one?" "No." "Good." She smiled nervously. "But he's insisting." I glanced at the clock. "Give him 10 minutes. When Richard finally walked into my office, he looked older than I remembered. His expensive confidence had been replaced by restless eyes and tired shoulders. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he forced a smile. "Emma." "Richard, I've been meaning to congratulate you. 5 years is a long delay." He ignored the comment and sat down without being invited. "You've done incredibly well. I've worked hard. I always knew you were ambitious." I almost laughed. 5 years ago, he'd called me untalented in front of the entire company. Now he wanted to rewrite history. "I don't remember you saying that." His smile faded. "I think we've both grown." "No," I replied calmly. "One of us did." His fingers tightened around the armrest. "I know why you're here." "You do. You want revenge." I folded my hands on the desk. "If I wanted revenge, Richard, you wouldn't be sitting in that chair having this conversation." He looked genuinely confused. "Then why buy the company?" I met his eyes without anger. "Because I refuse to let your mistakes destroy the lives of hundreds of innocent employees." For the first time since he entered my office, he had absolutely nothing to say. And somehow, that silence hurt him far more than any insult ever could. Richard sat there staring at me, searching my face for the anger he expected to find. Instead, all he found was calm. That unsettled him more than rage ever could. He cleared his throat. "So, what happens now?" "The audit happens now." His expression tightened. "You don't really think that's necessary?" "I think it's overdue." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Emma, every executive makes difficult decisions. There's a difference between making difficult decisions and making dishonest ones. You can't prove anything." I held his gaze for a moment before pressing a button on my desk. "Sarah, would you ask Mr. Bennett to come in?" A few seconds later, our independent lead auditor entered carrying several thick binders. He placed them carefully on my desk. "These are the preliminary findings." Richard's confidence disappeared. The auditor spoke professionally. "We've identified unauthorized financial adjustments, undisclosed conflicts of interest, executive bonuses approved despite losses, and multiple contracts awarded without competitive bidding." Richard interrupted. "Those decisions were legal." Mr. Bennett calmly opened another binder. "Some were. Others appear to violate company policy and fiduciary responsibilities." The room fell silent. Richard looked at me. "You planned this." I shook my head. "No, I planned to save the company." "You planned everything else." He stood abruptly. "This is a witch hunt." "No," I replied quietly. "This is accountability." He stormed out without another word. As the door closed, I let out a slow breath. 5 years ago, I would have dreamed about humiliating him in front of everyone. Now I realized something. Watching the truth speak for itself was infinitely more satisfying. Over the next several weeks, the company changed in ways I had once believed were impossible. The board accepted every recommendation from the independent audit. Several executives resigned before formal disciplinary proceedings even began. Others were removed by unanimous board vote. Richard's contract was terminated. No dramatic speeches. No public humiliation. Just facts. The same facts he had ignored for years. The news spread quickly throughout the company. Employees stopped whispering in hallways. Ideas began flowing again. Managers started listening instead of commanding. For the first time in years, people smiled without looking over their shoulders. One afternoon I held an open forum in the largest conference room. Anyone could ask any question. No filters. No punishment. A young analyst nervously raised her hand. "What if we disagree with leadership?" I smiled. "Then leadership should probably listen." A few people laughed. I continued. "I built my career by asking difficult questions. I lost my first career because I refused to ignore them. That will never happen here again." The room erupted into applause. Not because I had given a speech. Because they believed me. A month later, Melissa knocked on my office door. "Do you have a minute?" "Always." She stepped inside carrying a folder. "I've been offered a management position." "Congratulations." She smiled uncertainly. I almost turned it down. Why? I kept thinking, maybe I didn't deserve another chance. I remembered the woman who had stood silently in that conference room 5 years earlier. Fear had controlled her then. Now she was standing in front of me because she had earned an opportunity. "We're not defined forever by our worst moment," I said. We're defined by what we choose afterward. Tears filled her eyes. I won't waste this chance. I know. She left my office looking lighter than when she'd entered. So did I. A few days later, Ethan came to visit. He walked without the cane he had relied on for years. Watching him cross my office made me smile. You made it, I said. Barely. Your assistant is terrifying. I laughed. She's very protective. He looked out through the glass windows overlooking the city. You really own this place. I help lead it. He turned toward me. Mom would have been so proud. Those words hit harder than any promotion or headline ever had. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he wrapped me in a hug. You know, he said softly, I used to hate Richard for what he did to you. I know, I don't anymore. Neither do I. He looked surprised. Really, hating him kept me connected to the worst day of my life. So what do you feel now? I looked around the office. Employees moved confidently through the halls. Phones rang. People laughed. The company was alive again. Nothing. And I realized I meant it. Near the end of the year, I received a handwritten letter. There was no return address. Inside was a single page. Emma, you'll probably never forgive me, and I don't expect you to. Losing everything forced me to see what I spent years refusing to admit. I believed fear created respect. I believed success belonged only to people willing to crush others. I was wrong. I don't know whether this apology matters anymore. Richard. I folded the letter carefully. Then I placed it in a drawer. Not because I wanted to keep a reminder of him. Because I no longer needed one. The past had finally become just that, the past. Several months later, our company was recognized as one of the best places to work in the country. Reporters asked me the same question in nearly every interview. What changed the company? They expected me to talk about strategy, capital, restructuring. Instead, I always gave the same answer. We replaced fear with trust. Because every balance sheet begins with people. Every successful business begins with integrity. And every lasting victory begins the moment you stop trying to destroy the person who hurt you, and start building a life they could never take away. 5 years earlier, I had walked out of that building carrying a cardboard box while everyone watched in silence. Now, every morning, I walked through those same doors and saw employees who felt safe enough to speak, brave enough to challenge ideas, and proud enough to call the company their own. I hadn't bought the company to prove Richard wrong. I had bought it to prove to myself that the worst day of my life didn't have to become the rest of it. In the end, that was the only revenge that truly mattered.